ladies and gentlemen and non-binary students, you are all very welcome here. This is week 1 of the history of the family in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is one of my cat assistants. Her name is Kiciuncik. She's very shy, so she'll probably run away in a moment. And today we'll start talking about the study of the family structures in Britain mostly, but generally in Western civilization. We'll talk about various approaches to the study of the family, and the books that I will be using today mostly, I have already uploaded them to the course page on Moodle, so if you want to read them, which is a good idea, I recommend you go there. The first one is a rather small but quite concise and useful little book called Approaches to the History of the Western Family 1500 to 1914 by Michael Anderson. And the other book, and this is the main book that I'll be using in all things regarding the 18th century, is one of the seminal books in the subject of family history by Lawrence Stone. The title is The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800. The only thing I maybe not dislike, but I feel sorry about concerning this book is that it actually ends before the beginning of the 19th century, so we'll have to move to other sources to study the 19th century and the Victorian family structures, but otherwise this is a fantastic book. It's not exactly light reading, and it's quite long, but at least parts of it pertaining to the 18th century are definitely worth your time. So we'll talk about it in a little moment. As with all the beginnings, and especially when we talk about cultural history, it's quite important to notice a few things. First of all, definitions. The word family, the words like marriage, parenthood, motherhood, fatherhood, love, these are big words that many people take for granted. Most people believe that these words have always meant the same. That when we find, I don't know, ancient Roman poetry mentioning the word love or marriage, they have exactly the same meaning as what people believe by these words nowadays, which of course is not true. The perception of social structures, even the perception of very private or intimate feelings changes in history. Also, it changes geographically. So if you talk perhaps to a person from a completely different culture, perhaps somebody from India, and they talk about marriage, the dominant structures of society in the Indian culture are still very different to the Western culture. So they might mean completely something different. For example, this kind of default definition would be that marriages are arranged by parents. So you do not fall in love before you marry someone. You may, if you're lucky and if you work on it, fall in love after you are married to somebody. So the same word but completely different meanings. And this will be something that we will encounter time and time again during this course. There is a very famous saying, almost a kind of proverb, that the past is a foreign country and people do things differently there. It's absolutely true about private life. So we may be deluded into thinking that we know what they are talking about, what they mean by love, what they mean by morality, what they mean by family, but more often than not, these could be very different emotions and very different social structures than the ones that we take for granted today. So that's one thing. Another thing that I would like you to notice and to remember from the very beginning of our course is that in reference to private life, in reference to personal relationships, to sexuality and love and family, you can find basically anything at any given moment in history. So if we are talking about family models or some sort of behaviors, we are talking mostly about the dominant models and the dominant behaviors in a given cultural moment. Because at any time from the beginning of humanity really, you could find the whole spectrum of human behaviors, human preferences, human living arrangements. So you would have, just to mention a few, single people, single parents, both mothers and fathers, people being raised by their grandparents, people being raised by strangers, but also childless couples and homosexual couples. You would find this all in any culture because they are within a broad scope of human behaviors. And we are all humans, so not all of us are exactly the same. But at any historical and cultural moment, there usually was one or very few models of private life and personal and intimate relations that would be seen as good, moral, healthy, and even natural. They would very often use the term natural to indicate that something is dominant and that something is culturally regarded as valuable and worthy of propagation. And in different cultures, in time and also geographically, it could be something completely different. Like this case with arranged marriages. For a very long time, for the majority of European culture, arranged marriages were default. They were the natural, normal, good, moral thing. Because basically it was believed that marriage is a union between two families and not two individuals. This starts to change in the Enlightenment period, in the 18th century, and we will talk about it later on. But the dominant model of family life is very different from what we have today, and also it changes with the times. It changes with new philosophy, it changes with even some political events, like the French Revolution, which gave a lot of power to the middle class, that was only slowly developing from the time basically of the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century. And all these changes, material, political, economic, new inventions, new ways that people work, they are reflected and they influence private life and also family life. And we are going to talk about these changes during this semester. So just remember that the definitions that you may be most familiar with could not apply to historical reality, and that we are going to talk about the most typical or perhaps the most characteristic aspects or modes of private life in a very particular historical reality of the 18th and 19th century. Mostly in Britain, to some extent also in other Western cultures. Why? I will tell you in a little moment. Because now I would like to ask you the first question, a very simple question really. Who do you regard to be your family? When you think of family, who do you think about? And what criteria, what factors influence your list of your family members? So if we were in class, I would ask you this in class, and I hope to talk about it a little bit with you when we have the live meet. But what people normally think about, what I remember from previous editions of this course is, first of all, they think about blood relations. So your parents, your sisters, your brothers, your grandparents, people related to you by blood. So your blood relatives. These are your family. But if you think about it, some of these people may not be related to you by blood. They could have legal ties to you, like, let's say, the people who are related to you by marriage. Some of you may be married already, so perhaps even the closest members of your family are the ones that you chose yourself, your husband or your wife. But then again, they come with a family of their own, so you start to have in-laws. You start to have the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, the brother-in-law, the sister-in-law, and other members of your family who are not really related to you by blood. The same applies, let's say, to your aunts and uncles, the ones who are not brothers and sisters to your parents, but are married to them. So they are still your aunts and uncles, but they are not related by blood to you. Some of you may know somebody, or perhaps even be adopted yourself. Then again, some of the closest members of your family are not your blood relations. They are related to you by the laws of adoption. So, so we have two completely different things. We have the blood relations and we have those legal relations. What else was mentioned? Cohabitation, so living together. Very often, and historically this is quite true, we'll talk about it in a little moment. The family were people living together, whether they are blood relations or they are legal relations, or perhaps some other people like friends or even servants. In the historical reality, most rich households had live-in servants. So the term family was sometimes applied to include the members of one household, including the servants, or including some, let's say, cohabitating friends. Would it still apply in your situation? Do you live with your family? I know that many students live with roommates. Sometimes these are your close friends. Sometimes they could even be strangers. Would you still use the word family to refer to them. So cohabitation, the third thing. And the fourth thing is emotional ties. So if you, for example, if you're now living with your friends as roommates, you may think about them as your family because you are so emotionally attached to them. Perhaps even more than to your blood relations. Perhaps you have a best friend whom you treat like a sister or a brother. Would you use the word family to describe such a relation? In many cases, in such close friendship, people get to know entire families of their friends. So you do not know only this one person and you meet privately somewhere, like, I don't know, in a cafe or in a club or at the university. But you know their parents, you know their siblings, you know other members of their, let's say, blood relations. Does the word family apply here? So your emotional connections. And on the other hand, can you think of members of your blood family, blood relations, that you do not particularly like, or perhaps even dislike? Do you still count them as your family? Would you call them your family? How important is their emotional connection to the person? Another question, do they have to be alive? Do you ever think of your dead relatives or other close ones? Do you think of them as of the family? What about the ancestors that you never met? You only know from stories and perhaps photographs, or perhaps not even there. You know they were there before you, but nobody remembers them anymore. You just know they were there. Perhaps the name survives somewhere on a gravestone. Do you think about them as your family? Or does it only include the living members of the family? So I'm not giving you the answers because the answers can really differ, and they can hopefully show you how different factors play a role here in determining, even in your own personal case, who is and who isn't your family. The last factor, do they have to be human? I actually think my cats are members of my family, and they are not human. They are what you would call non-human animals. So do you have some non-human animals that you think are members of your family? Or do you exclude them? Are they just pets? So a different category. So it can vary from one person to another, but usually in a culture, in a historical moment, there is some consensus of what family is. I would say probably in the contemporary culture, this is the blood relation plus the legal relation, without much attention paid to cohabitation and even the emotional connections. But it can really differ from one person to another, from one culture to another, from one historical period to another. And this is something that we are going to encounter here in this course quite a lot. So in a moment we'll talk about different ways of studying the history of the family and different approaches to the subject by the scholars.